Chapter 16. In Apostolic Fellowship. The burden is now borne by two pairs of shoulders instead of one. The care is cast upon two hearts and heads, rejoiced Asbury, as he went out from the General Conference of 1808. The countenance of his colleague gave him joy, and the council's inspired confidence. The zeal and apostolicity of Asbury were truly matched in McKendry. Moreover, in the rugged and rustic Westerner, Asbury was constantly discovering evidences that his coming to power had been an overt providence. In consequence of this discovery, he felt the first easement of the burden of responsibility which had rested upon him since the days that Rankin and Shadford left him to the primacy of the societies in North America. The judgment of Coke he had always, with good reason, distrusted, while the incumbency of Watcote had only added to his concern and difficulties. Now he saw his own increasing lack of service to the churches about to be supplied by an associate as wise, as careful, as tireless as himself. Asbury's feelings at this time are well typed in his journal. Such human-like matters as sitting for a portrait in crayon and planning for a month's vacation in the pleasant fields give variety to his entries. An uncommonly sad entry is also to be noted about this time. Harry Dorsey Gow, his long-loved friend, had died near the opening of the General Conference, and as Paul had been followed to the grave by the members of that body. On the 5th of June, to a great standing in the open, Asbury preached a sermon in memory of the dead. The discourse was very much a portraiture of Mr. Gow's religious experience and character, which illustrated both the inconsistency of human flesh and the miracle working power of divine grace. Gow had known the ecstasy of faith and the bitterness of apostasy, but his days had closed in clear and perfect light. Asbury thus saw the friends and events of his earlier ministry passing into memory and history. Now, apostasy in Christianity is that biblically has the death penalty, but not all people agree with that even are Christian. Like, not all faiths have that, The first official sitting for the new Episcopal year was that of the Western Conference, calendared to begin October 1st at Liberty Hall, 12 miles from Nashville, in the state of Tennessee. McKendry had already turned his face westward, and passing through the territory of his former district, crossed the Mississippi River and entered the Missouri Valley settlements in the lands recently acquired from the French. He was thus the first Methodist bishop, or, as for that, the first Protestant bishop, to cross the great Midland waters and establish a diocese in the ultimate West. Fire fell from his lips as he went, and on his return he left a revival burning through the settlements for 100 miles, up to the romantic valley. About July 1st, Asbury began a slow journey westward, with a conference session to be held in the Cumberland Basin as his objective point. For a traveling companion, he had engaged Henry Bohme, a strong-bodied, consecrated itinerant, of whose father, a German minister, in fellowship with Otterbein, we have already heard. Asbury's object in selecting Henry Bohme was not only to have a companion in travel, but also, through him, to reach the people of the numerous German settlements in the Ohio Valley. In this office, Bohme developed great efficiency and for several years traveled with the bishop in his wide circuits. His notes of their many itinerancies are full and spirited, and are valuable sidelights of the Asburian story. The course mapped out by Asbury for his journey lay through the states of Maryland, Ohio, parts of the territory of Indiana, and thence through Kentucky and Tennessee to the southernmost dip of the Cumberland Basin. More than once, the ailing and feeble bishop sank under the exhaustion caused by the hardships of travel, but rose again, sometimes on crutches, sometimes half borne in the arms of his companion, to enter a church or mount his horse for another stage. Nor was the journey a profitless one by the way. In chapels, in cabins, and at camp meetings, in the wilds, scores, perhaps hundreds, of professional of people professed converting grace. I rejoice to think there will be 400 or 500 camp meetings this year. May this outdo all former years in the conversion of precious souls to God, mused the faithful man as he rode through the straining new lands, dotted only here and there with settlements. The old-time camp meeting has never been fully appraised as a primordial force. It not only gave fervency and carrying power to early religious experience, exposed to the unfriendliness of pioneer crudeness and ignorance, but it served to create and cement social affinities that resulted in an instant use of sympathy and cooperation, and which typed and determined the spirit of the settled community in an after time. To trace the silent influences of the Asburian apostolate on our national life, one must fully study both his personal and his official relations to the men and women who lit these watchfires of faith and fellowship across the continent. Indian summer, with its haze and calm, was clothing the hills of Tennessee when Asbury and his companion entered the Cumberland Basin, where Bishop McKendry met them and conducted them to the seat of the Western Conference. Nowadays, we call Indian summer, well, no, I don't, but every time there's something abnormally warm. As in, it's normal to have these patterns of up and down weather, but if it's warmer than average, it's global warming, out of control. I mean, there is pollution and stuff like that happening, but it's, people are trying to make it sound like some 2012 movie or something. The scene of the sitting was a camp meeting to which the itinerants had gathered from Holston, Natchez, Opelousas, Missouri, Illinois, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. In the neighborhood of the campground was the new home of the Reverend Greenhill, whose name is indissolubly linked with the early history of Methodism in North Carolina, and in this home the business sessions were held. It was the first conference which McKendree attended as a bishop. It is to be inferred from the tone of Bishop Asbury's journal that McKendree took only a minor part in the administration of the session. He was naturally in the role of training and introduction for a time, but he early laid hold of the helm of affairs with a strong hand and a confident spirit. He saw the necessity for and early adopted an orderly plan for bringing forward the business of the conference. But to the disturbance of Asbury, he began to call the presiding elders together to consult in making the appointments, and thus it is to him that Methodism owes the cabinet and the placing of the presiding eldership in possession of its logical and historic function as an integrant of the episcopacy. It is indicative of Asbury's confidence in McKendree's wisdom and foresight that he at last cheerfully acquiesced in every advance which his colleague proposed. The ground. The synod. In the wilderness, having concluded its business, the two bishops, with Asbury's companion Bose, started across the mountains eastward for the round of the Atlantic conferences, whose sittings were to run into the middle of the year 1809. The next in order after the Western was the South Carolina, or as Asbury laconically puts it, the South Conference, and this was their present objective, though a great preaching and visiting detour was made through parts of North Carolina, with the inevitable circle through Charleston, which was a stage or two from the seat of the conference at Milledgeville, Georgia. The senior bishop's notion was that the people should see and know their general superintendents. His labor was to show himself the servant of all, and in this purpose and its execution he found his associate no whit behind himself. Together in a $30 chaise, they rode their wide circuit. Did these two primitive, heroic, apostolic bishops. On their journey, great news came to them concerning the revivals in every quarter. Baltimore and Bohemia Manor, the early loves of Asbury, had been blessed with extraordinary visitations. Camp meetings have done this, exclaimed Asbury, adding a new strophe to his Song of Tabernacles. Of course, the Asburian rote of reading, writing, prayers, and meditations went on daily. It would seem that as the travels of the sexagenarian bishop increased, his capacity for reading also increased, for his journal tells constantly of incursions into new volumes, though they were generally of the same class as those read in earlier years, and so could not have suggested any strikingly new ideals are brought to him, radically fresh interpretations of life, manners, or theology. Now, we can say that when it comes to the court cards, that the king is along with the 2s, the queen along with the 3s, the 4s, 5s, 6s, 7s, 8s, and 9s, being 6 is for the princes. And the princesses, you've got the 10s. But so we have a lot of 6-part bets to consider. The conference session in Georgia is now chiefly memorable as the one at which William Capers was received on trial into the traveling connection as preacher, editor, educator, missionary, secretary, secretary, and bishop. The name of William Capers remains one of the chief glories of our history. As the founder of the missions to the slaves, he will be remembered, perhaps when every other claim to renown has been disallowed. He early grew into the affection and confidence of Asbury, and the pictures which he sketched of the tenderness, simplicity, and human kindness of the venerable superintendent are pleasing in the extreme. The conference in Georgia had been held during the Christmas New Year week. Through the snows and biting winds of January, the 2 bishops and their companion proceeded to Tarboro, North Carolina, where the Virginia Conference was to begin its sitting on February 1st. McKendry was here amongst his kith and kin and took a large share in the administrations. This was even now a conference great in its personnel. At least 60 of the itinerants were reckoned by Asbury to be the most pleasing and promising young men, but with 3 exceptions, they were unmarried. Why? Because the high taste of the Southerners would not permit their daughters to wed with men so poor in worldly goods. All the better, declared Asbury, for a celibate clergy was his preference, if not his ideal. Pauline Christianity kinds of turns from marriage, really, but there are 4 reasons to get married. And the most important, the one where you actually, might fall in love, is the one on character. Now, if some people like the body and the fun of that, or what they think they'll have of that anyways. It doesn't all have to be sexual, but others want the wealth, others want the status that the relationship will bring. But no matter how good those are, even if they improve, the feelings will fade to a degree. And of course, the spiritual character would be where we'd focus on here, being a talk on religion. But the question of African slavery, always uppermost with Asbury, was again on the conferences, but as far out of the way of settlement as before. In his journal, he asks a question which may well be taken as expressing the crux of the discussion in those earlier years. Would not an amelioration of the condition and treatment of the slaves have produced more practical good to the poor African than any attempt at their emancipation? Happily, the question has now only a reminiscential interest. The recital, however, serves to show the sanity and moderation of the first bishop of American Methodism. When were the Jim Crow laws? They were after this book was written, right? Just proof that things were not better for a while. The sessions of the Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York conferences, which followed in succession after the rising of the Virginians, were without noteworthy incident. In both New York and Philadelphia, however, Asbury had such tangles and annoyances of administration to deal with as caused him to sensibly recall the days of his early pastorates in those cities, the 3 conference sessions, and the necessary intervals between them carried the episcopal calendar forward to a date near the end of May. In the meantime, not a few refreshing experiences came to Asbury and his 2 traveling companions, McKendry and Boham, to whom he affectionately refers as the young men. Calls were made during the northward journey at Baltimore and Barrett's Chapel, both luminous spots in the memory of the senior superintendent. At Perry Hall he tarried long enough to view the graves of his departed friends. The Gowes. The image of my dear departed Harry Gow was very present to me. It is a touch in his journal. At this place, wondrously and humanly illuminating, great friendships are possible only to great souls. Hearing at this juncture that the son of a former familiar in the township of the Gowes had enlisted and gone to serve with the military in New Orleans, he resolved instantly to send a missionary to that far-away city, and wrote to the presiding elder of the Mississippi district to dispatch a man to the new field. Gregory did not more truly covet the Engels than did this man the new-made Americans in the South, nor did the pontiff act so promptly as did the meterless head of the youngest Protestant sect. There's a chain. I'm not sure how many are in the chain or how widespread the chain is, but there's an Ingles grocery store. So, at some point, Ingles and Engels, I'm sure, meet somewhere. In ancestry. At Barrett's Chapel, Asbury had an incentive to review the 24 years that followed his meeting with Coke and the adoption of their wise and heaven-guided plans for realizing the ideals of the Scriptures and the primitive church. Amid the shades of this quietude, he was visited by his dear friends, Governor Bassett and his lady, who drove nearly 40 miles to meet him. A simple tribute paid to simple worth, this man made his friends a part of himself. Of another sort is that journal note concerning the steamboat, a great invention. This the 2 bishops and the rustic Mark saw in the Hudson soon after Fulton had made it a potent and prophetic fact. My attention was strongly excited, writes Asbury. No man was better fitted than he to measure in a moment of anticipating the meaning to the new world of this tide-climbing invention. He knew that vast distances that separated the nation's centers of life and wealth. He knew also the courses and had measured with his eye the capable bosoms of America's great rivers. In vision he saw the wonders of a time made possible by the magic of steam. The New England Conference, held at Monmouth, District of Maine, completed the episcopal round for the year, Methodism had struck its roots deeply and firmly in the soil of the land of the Presbyterians. But Asbury saw much that displeased and troubled him, much in the land, much in the conduct of Methodist affairs. Most of all, he deplored his own lack of an intimate knowledge of the field and the men. The standard of responsibility which he set for himself in the oversight of the general work was not lower than that which he set for his preachers in the care of their circuits. So it seems that Christians were there, but somehow their souls needed saved by changing churches. But it seems that things were more so when my father says when he was a kid that, people around, if you're Presbyterian or you Baptist or, particularly if it was the difference between Protestant and non-Protestant, then, like people for a long time have said the different Catholic and Christian. It's like, well, Catholics really were pretty much everything we call Christian started, but by the customary circuitous route through the lake region of New York and southward through Pennsylvania, the two bishops and their companions were at last at the end of the years-long journey. But it was only to begin again the ceaseless round of the continent. Within a fortnight, they were in Ohio, on the way to Cincinnati, where the Western Conference was to meet at the end of September. It is indicative of the courtesy and refinement of Asbury's nature that the hardships which he so often endured and uncouth manners which he so often met did not sap the strength nor dim the perfection of his ideals. Sleeping often on the bare floors of cabins, constantly covered with dust or bespattered with mud in the way, dining on coarse and ill-prepared food, and not seldom amid squalid and unsanitary surroundings. Neither the dignity of manliness nor the gentleness of sainthood ever forsook him. In spirit he quickly recognized a discourtesy, and in his soul reprobated a boorish man, though it is doubtful if he habitually expressed himself on such shortcomings except to his journal. To the keeping of that confident he committed the record of many brutish manners and even personal slights. In one of these records it is recited the fact that while he was preaching in a certain place, a presiding elder put his feet upon the chancel. This breach of decorum greatly annoyed the one-time saddler's apprentice, whose religion had helped to make him a prince of good manners. So much of good manners just made up per region, but particularly delicate were his courtesies to Bishop McKendry, although he had written of him at first as an assistant, and although the strength and foresight of McKendry often voted the judgment of his senior, there seems, in fact, never to have been a serious jar in their relations. When they were separated, as happened in the early part of the second year's journey, Asbury habitually wrote to his associate in a tone of affectionate tenderness, as also of the Apostolic Council, The session of the Western Conference for 1809 must have been something in the nature of a Pentecost. The fires of revival were burning in every direction, and when the two bishops met at Cincinnati to station the preachers, they found 3,000 worshippers ready to join in the devotions. The reports for that year showed that the increase in this field was 2,666 members over all losses. Turning from the wilderness echoing with the shouts of victorious Israel and glowing with campfires. Israel as in the upright of God, or they considered themselves to be the upright of God. The Episcopal party found itself at the end of a month on the North Carolina seaboard. It was the 8th time within 9 years that Asbury had scaled the American Alps, as he constantly named the Appalachian chain. In his day he decreed that there should be no Alps. As was now a custom with him, Asbury took little needed rest near the year's end. In the genial and healthful atmosphere of Charleston, here at Christmastide, the conference sat. That body arising just before New Year's, he immediately set out with his associate on a tour that ended on February 8th at Petersburg, the seat of the Virginia Conference. The land was now filled with memories for the aged itinerant. Nearly 40 years had elapsed since he began to ride the reaches over which this journey carried him. Here were great times 30 years ago, he wrote. Saith not the word, your old men shall dream dreams. But this man was a seer also. That's a hint at the verse in the Bible, isn't it? I don't really know which. I don't remember which verse. But let's be real. We all dream dreams. There are different sources of dreams. Is the dream from the devil? Is the dream from yourself? Well, devils, but dream from yourself. Or is the dream sanctioned by God? Even if it's spiritual, that doesn't mean that it's straight up God approved or something. I mean, for you to take it literally. And can you influence your dreams? And